at that time, which his foundation had sponsored, and it was an AAI convention, and Kath and I, it was in 2009, and Kath and I went to it and thought, if this really sucks, we're in Burbank. And we never left the meeting room. It was an amazing experience, and it's what kind of started this whole thing off. But I remember the first time we met him because we were having breakfast, and it was kind of a breakfast buffet. And Richard kind of walked up to us in a bit of a panic and said, I have to introduce Andy Thompson, and I don't know where the room is. You probably don't remember that. I'm not sure where the room is. And they used to have, at these conferences, they had like multiple things going on at the same time. So there was room A with so-and-so in it, and room B, and he wasn't quite sure where Andy Thompson was, so we helped him out with that. And he said thank you and went and introduced Andy Thompson. But I just thought at that time, like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like, he didn't have to come up and just ask us. He could have went and asked an organizer, or he could have went and asked somebody that put the thing on. And every time I've ever seen him at a conference, including the 2 INR he's been at, he's just a class act. I mean, he walks in and he sits down at your table, right? And doesn't think anything of it. And I just think someone that doesn't think they deserve a lot of respect deserves all the respect. And I have a lot of respect for this man. Anybody that can go to Virginia and talk about atheism deserves our respect. And he has that from me, and I'm sure he has it from all of you. So please welcome Professor Richard Dawkins.
I had completely forgotten the story you told, but it's pretty much the story of my life, wandering around lost. I have to apologize for not sending in my title. My title, as you now see it, is The Tyranny of the Discontinuous Mind. I once had a puzzled letter from a lawyer who just read one of my books. He brought the full weight of his legal acumen to bear on the following nice point. If species A evolves into species B, he reasoned closely, there must come a point when a parent belongs to the old species A and his child belongs to the new species B. Members of different species cannot, by definition, interbreed with one another. It is unreasonable to expect a child to be so different from its parents as to be incapable of interbreeding with their kind. I put it to you, he wound up, wagging his metaphorical finger, in the special way that lawyers, at least in fiction, have perfected as their own, that this is a fatal flaw in the theory of evolution. Doesn't this reasoning undermine the whole idea of evolution? And I thought lawyers were supposed to have trained, logical, clear-thinking minds. Here's what I was too polite to say in reply. On your 18th birthday, you become a voter. Before your 18th birthday, you were a non-voter. Does this undermine the whole theory of human growth and development? Whatever else may be undermined by this lawyer's close reasoning, it is not evolution. The lawyer would be surprised and I hope intrigued by so-called ring species. The best known example is the herring gull and lesser blackback gull, the genus Larus. Herring gulls and lesser blackback gulls breed in mixed colonies in Western Europe, and they don't interbreed. They're good species. They're defined as good species, therefore. But if you travel in a westerly direction around the northern hemisphere and sample the gulls as you go around, you'll find that the local gulls vary from the light gray of the herring gull, getting gradually darker as you progress around the North Pole, until eventually, when you get all the way around to Western Europe again, they have darkened so far that they have become lesser blackback gulls. And the neighboring populations interbreed with each other all the way around, even though the ends of the ring The two species we see in Britain don't interbreed. Are they distinct species or not? Who cares? Only those tyrannized by the discontinuous mind feel obliged to answer the question. If it were not for the accidental extinction of evolutionary intermediates all the way around the northern hemisphere, they would be classified quite simply as separate species. But every species, if it were not for the accident of extinction, is linked in a similar way to every other species. We're linked to kangaroos in a similar way. A ring species is just a geographical special case in the spatial dimension of what must happen all the time in evolution in the time dimension. Another well-worked example of a ring species, which would confuse this lawyer, is the genus INR7, Californian salamanders, which form a ring around the Central Valley of California. Now, this is a hypothetical ring species that I invented. It didn't happen, but it could have happened. It could have happened that the intermediates between humans and chimpanzees existed in a ring all around the middle of Africa. What would be the moral implications if all the links in the ring were still around and capable of mating with each other to produce fertile offspring? What would it do to laws that forbid human slavery yet permit us to lock chimpanzees up in cages, use them for experiments? It's a sheer accident that the intermediates between ourselves and chimpanzees just happen to be extinct. By intermediates, I'm not suggesting that we're descended from chimpanzees, of course. Everybody here realizes that. Common ancestors up there, chimpanzees come down there, we come down there. The intermediates mean this one, 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 and this one. They could have all been still alive, but they're not. Therefore, we are quite separate species from chimpanzees. But if the intermediates happen to be still alive in Africa, then we would have to have, in order to implement our speciesist laws and our way we organize our society, we would have to have courts of law like they had in South Africa to determine whether somebody could pass for white. We would have to have courts of law to determine whether some individual passes for human. And it isn't only chimps that are linked to us by chains of interfertile individuals who just happen to be extinct. It's cows and pigs, and indeed every species on Earth. It's no secret that paleontology is a controversial subject in which there are personal enmities. Roger Lewin's title, Bones of Contention, is apt as well as witty, and it's too good for others not to have used it before and since. If you look at what two paleontologists are arguing about, quarreling about, as often as not it turns out to be a name. Is this fossil Homo erectus? Is it archaic Homo sapiens? Is this one early Homo habilis? Is it a late member of the genus Australopithecus? People evidently feel really strongly about such questions, although they usually turn out to be hair-splitting. They resemble theological questions, which I suppose gives a clue as to why people feel so passionately about them. We're human. Surely there must have been a first person, mustn't there? So speaks the tyrannized, discontinuous mind. There never was a first person. With rare exceptions, mostly in plants, every individual that ever existed belonged to the same species as its parents and its children. There never was a first rabbit, never a first crocodile, never a first dragonfly. Every creature ever born belonged to the same species as its children, its parents, its grandparents. There never was a first Homo sapiens, never a baby Homo sapiens born to loving Homo erectus parents. That's not the way it works. The genus that preceded ours was Australopithecus. There never was a first Homo baby born to Australopithecus parents. Yet, if you go back far enough, never once violating the rule that a parent has to belong to the same species as its children, if you go back far enough, you come to, for example, your 185 million greats grandparent, the fish. Of course, there's no paradox here. Once you banish the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, it's not at all difficult to understand. We're so used to gradual changes that step by step, one after the other, make up a big change. You were once a baby, now you're not. There is never a day when you can say, last night I went to bed middle-aged. This morning I seem to be old. You're always the same person you were the night before, yet after a sufficiently large number of nights, you who were once a baby wake up an old-age pensioner. The tyranny of the discontinuous mind is my name for what philosophers call essentialism. It dates back to Plato. Plato took his characteristically Greek geometer's view of things and forced it where it didn't belong. Do we need the ringing? Am I not loud enough without it? Can you hear me okay? Okay. For Plato, the geometer, a circle or a right-angled triangle was an ideal form, definable mathematically, hanging up out there in space somewhere, but never realized in practice. A circle drawn in the sand was an imperfect approximation to the ideal Platonic circle hanging up there in idealized abstract space. That works for geometric shapes like circles and triangles, but essentialism has been applied to living things. And Ernst Mayr, the great evolutionary biologist and ornithologist, blamed essentialism for humanity's late discovery of evolution, astonishingly as late as the 19th century, 2 centuries after Newton, which I always find very hard to believe. If you treat all flesh and blood rabbits as imperfect approximations to an ideal Platonic rabbit, it won't occur to you that rabbits might have evolved from a non-rabbit ancestor and might evolve into a non-rabbit descendant. If you think, following the dictionary definition of essentialism, that the essence of rabbitness is prior to the essence of rabbits, the existence of rabbits. So the essence of rabbitness is prior to the existence of rabbits, that's what they say. Whatever prior to might mean, by the way, and that's nonsense in itself. If you think that, evolution is not an idea that will spring to your mind, and you may resist it when somebody else suggests it. So Mayr blames essentialism, blames the tyranny of the discontinuous mind for the astonishingly long delay before humanity tumbled to the idea of evolution. Well, so far I've been talking about evolutionary biology. The tyranny of the discontinuous mind shows itself in all sorts of other fields, which is what I'm now coming on to. Where else does the tyranny of the discontinuous mind show itself? When does it become hot? When you're a frog in a pot of water that's being heated up? When is a young person old enough to drive? The law insists on a definite cut-off point, usually the stroke of midnight on a particular birthday, although exactly which birthday varies from country to country. And such a cut-off is legally unavoidable, of course, you've got to have it, and the same is true of voting age, but there's no getting away from its arbitrariness. But there are plenty of other cases where we have a cut-off and we don't actually need one. What percentage of the population lies below the poverty line? When I call that a silly question, a question that doesn't deserve an answer, I'm not being callous or unfeeling about poverty. I care very much if children starve, pensioners shiver with cold. My objection is just one of my many examples. My objection is to the very idea of a line, a gratuitously manufactured discontinuity in what is actually a continuous reality. Who decides how poor is poor enough to qualify as below the poverty line? What's to stop us moving the line, thereby changing the score? Poverty or wealth is a continuously distributed quantity which might be measured as income per week or per year. Why throw away the information, that information, by splitting a continuous variable into two discontinuous categories, above and below some fictional line? The tyranny of the discontinuous mind. How many men are above the obesity threshold? Obviously, once again, fatness, weight, whatever it is a continuous variable. You can simply state the man's weight. You don't have to say, is he or is he not above the obesity line? Is he technically obese or not? How many of us lie below the stupidity line? How many runners exceed the fast line? How many Oxford undergraduates lie above the first class line? Because, of course, we in universities do it too. Examination performance of students, like most measures of human ability or achievement, is a continuous variable. Its frequency distribution is bell-shaped. Yet British universities insist on publishing a class list in which a minority of students receive first-class degrees, rather a lot obtain seconds, sometimes divided into upper and lower seconds, and a few get thirds. And that would make sense if the distribution had 3 or 4 peaks with deep valleys in between, but of course it doesn't. Anybody who's ever marked an exam knows that the bottom of one class is separated from the top of the class below by a small fraction of the distance that separates it from the top of its own class. This fact alone points to an unfairness in the system of discontinuous classification, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. Examiners go to great trouble to assign a score, a numerical score, perhaps out of 100, to each exam essay. Essays are double or even triple marked for fairness by different examiners. They then argue about the nuances of whether an essay deserves 55 or 52 marks. The marks are scrupulously added up, normalized, transformed, juggled, and fought over. The final marks that emerge and the rank orders of students are as richly informative as conscientious examiners can achieve. But then what happens to all that richness of information? Most of it is simply thrown away. Reckless disregard for all the labor and nuanced deliberation and calculation and adjusting that went into the great addition sum. The students are simply bundled into 3 or 4 distinct classes, and that's all the information that penetrates outside the examiner's room. Cambridge mathematicians, as one might expect, finesse the discontinuity and leak the rank order unofficially. It became informally known that Jacob Bronowski was the senior wrangler, that's the Cambridge language for the top mathematician of his year. Bertrand Russell was the 7th wrangler of his year, and so on. At other universities too, tutors' testimonials may say things like, "Not only did she get a first, I can tell you in confidence that the examiners ranked her number 3 of the entire class of 106 in the university." Now that's the kind of information that really counts in a letter of recommendation. And it's that very information that is wantonly thrown away in the officially published class list, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. Well, perhaps such wastage of information is inevitable, a necessary evil. I don't want to make too much of it, but what's perhaps more serious is that there are some educators, dare I say especially in non-scientific subjects, who fool themselves into believing that there's a kind of Platonic ideal called the first-class mind, or the alpha mind, a qualitatively distinct category, as distinct as female is from male, or sheep from goat. This is an extreme form of the discontinuous mind. It can probably be traced again to the essentialism of Plato, which, to repeat, might be one of the most pernicious ideas in all history. Where else does the tyranny of the discontinuous mind rear its ugly head? In US presidential elections, every state except Maine and Nebraska has to end up labeled either Democrat or Republican, no matter how evenly divided the voters in that state might be. Each state sends to the Electoral College a number of delegates which is proportional to the population of the state. So far, so good. But the discontinuous mind insists that all the delegates from a given state have to vote the same way. This winner-take-all system was shown up in all its fatuity in the 2000 election when there was a dead heat in Florida. Al Gore and George Bush received the same number of votes as each other in Florida. The tiny disputed difference was well within the margin of error. Florida, in 2000, sent 25 delegates to the Electoral College. The Supreme Court was asked to decide which candidate should receive all 25 votes, and therefore the presidency. Since it was a dead heat, it might have seemed reasonable to allot 13 votes to one candidate and 12 to the other. It would have made no difference whether Bush or Gore received the 13 votes. Either way, Gore would have been president. Gore could have given Bush 22 of the 25 Electoral College delegates, and Gore would still have won the presidency. Now, I'm not saying that the Supreme Court should actually have split the Florida delegates. They had to abide by the constitutional rules, no matter how idiotic those rules might be. But given the lamentable rule that the 25 votes had to be bound together as a one-party bloc, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, couldn't a sense of natural justice have led the court to allocate the 25 votes to the candidate who would have won the election if the Florida delegates had been divided, namely Gore, or to the candidate who won the popular vote in the country at large, namely Gore? They were in effect tossing a penny, so they could have tossed it in a less unfairly arbitrary way. But that's not the point I'm making here. My point here is that the winner-take-all idea of an electoral college in which each state has an indivisible block of members, either all Democrat or all Republican, no matter how close the vote, is a shockingly undemocratic manifestation of the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. Why is it so hard to admit that there are intermediates, half measures, as Maine and Nebraska do? Most states are not red or blue, but a complex mixture. Historically, the Electoral College began as rather a sensible system. Voters didn't choose between presidential candidates. Instead, they voted for respected citizens in their state who would do the choosing for them, which is what we do in universities when we choose a new professor. We set up a selection committee. They meet, take up references, interview candidates, read their books and papers, and then finally vote. In the case of the Electoral College, the rot set in when delegates to the college ceased to deliberate and simply were pledged to vote for one presidential candidate or another. Winner take all. The tyranny of the discontinuous mind again. However narrow the margin in, say, Florida, all 29 Electoral College members, as it is now, have to be pledged to one presidential candidate or the other. Which means, of course, that the winner of the Electoral College and the presidency can be, in the same election, massively defeated in the popular vote, as happened in this latest election. It also means that campaigning is largely confined to borderline states, and many people in, say, California know that they needn't bother to vote at all. It's widely agreed that the Electoral College system should be abolished, but unfortunately, it's not widely enough. It requires a constitutional amendment, and that requires at least a two-thirds majority in both houses. Given vested interest, this is almost impossible to achieve. Ways around it have been suggested, all depending on the fact that the federal constitution allows each state to choose its own way of electing its allocated number of Electoral College members. The Nebraska-Maine solution, whereby the Electoral College votes are allocated pro rata, sounds okay, but it would work only if all states agreed simultaneously to do it. If, say, California decided to go it alone and go over to the Maine-Nebraska system, it would be a disaster. I mean, Democrats would never win another election. I've stressed those cases where the real world is continuously distributed and we humans impose artificial discontinuities. That's what I'm mostly talking about. But of course, there are genuine discontinuities in the real world. Carbon monoxide really is distinct from carbon dioxide. There really is no overlap. There are no intermediates. A molecule consists of a carbon and one oxygen or a carbon and two oxygens. You can't have a carbon and 1.5 oxygens. One of those gases is deadly poisonous, the other is needed by plants to make the organic substances that we all depend upon. Gold really is distinct from silver. Diamond crystals really are different from graphite crystals. Both carbon, but the carbon atoms naturally arrange themselves in two quite distinct ways. There are no intermediates. The trouble is that there seems to be some sort of glitch in the human mind which makes us want to see discontinuities everywhere, even in those places, a huge number of places where there are none. Listen to the following newspaper bulletin published during a flu epidemic in Britain. Or was it an epidemic? And that was the question. This is the newspaper bulletin. Official statistics show there are 144 people in every 100,000 suffering from flu, said a spokeswoman for the Department of Health. As the usual gauge of an epidemic is 400 in every 100,000, it is not being officially treated as an epidemic by the government. But, the spokeswoman added, Professor Donaldson is happy to stick by his version that this is an epidemic. He believes it is more than 144 per 100,000. It is very confusing, and it depends on which definition you choose. Professor Donaldson has looked at his graph and said it is a serious epidemic. End of quote. What we know is that at least 144 people in every 100,000 were suffering from flu. Doesn't that in itself tell us what we want to know? Yet, for the spokeswoman, the important question was whether this counts as an epidemic. Did it cross the line to become an epidemic? Actually, in the case of epidemics, there really is a kind of natural Rubicon, a critical mass of infections above which the virus or bacterium suddenly takes off and dramatically increases its rate of spreading. This is why public health officials try so hard to vaccinate more than a critical proportion of the population against, say, whooping cough. It's not just to protect the individuals vaccinated, it's also to deprive the bacteria, in this case, in the whooping cough case, of the opportunity to reach their own critical mass for takeoff. In the case of that flu epidemic, what should really worry the spokeswoman for the Ministry of Health is whether the flu virus has yet crossed its Rubicon for takeoff and leapt abruptly into high gear in its spread through the population. And this should be decided by direct inspection of changing trends in daily infection figures, not by reference to magic numbers like 400 per 100,000. Concern with such magic numbers is a mark of what I'm calling the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. To the discontinuous mind, an embryo is either a person or is not. The discontinuous mind cannot grasp the idea of half a person or 3/4 of a person. Some absolutists, especially Roman Catholics, go right back to conception as the moment when the person comes into existence, the instant the soul is injected. So all abortion is murder by definition. The Catholic doctrine of the faith, entitled Donum Vitae. What am I saying? Anybody want to sing it? It's brilliant. You've all seen the Monty Python film, have you? Yeah. This is a quote from the Catholic doctrine of the faith, Donum Vitae. From the moment that the ovum is fertilized, a new life is begun, which is neither that of the father nor of the mother. It is rather the life of a new human being with his own growth. It would never be made human if it were not human already. To this perpetual evidence, modern genetic science brings valuable confirmation. It has demonstrated that from the first instant, the program is fixed as to what this living being will be, a man, this individual man with his characteristic aspects already well determined. Right from fertilization is begun the adventure of a human life. It's amusing to tease such absolutists by confronting them with a pair of identical twins. They split after fertilization, of course, and ask the twins which one got the soul, which twin is the non-person, the zombie. A puerile taunt, Maybe. But it hits home because the belief that it destroys is puerile and ignorant. Quote again, "It would never be made human if it were not human already." Really? Are you serious? Nothing can become something if it's not that something already? Is an acorn an oak tree? Is a hurricane the barely perceptible zephyr that seeds it? Would you apply your doctrine to evolution too? Do you suppose there was a moment in evolutionary history when a non-person gave birth to the first person? Essentialism rears its ugly head in racial terminology. The majority of African Americans are of mixed race. Yet so entrenched is our essentialist mindset, American official forms require everyone to tick one race ethnicity box or another, no room for intermediates. In the United States today, a person will be called African American even if only, say, one of his 8 great-grandparents was of African descent. Colin Powell and Barack Obama are described as black. They do have black ancestors, but they also have white ancestors. So why don't we call them white? It's a weird convention that the descriptor black behaves as the cultural equivalent of a genetic dominant. Gregor Mendel, the father of genetics, crossed wrinkled and smooth peas, and the offspring were all smooth. Smoothness is dominant. When a white person breeds with a black person, the child is intermediate, but is labeled black. The cultural label is transmitted down the generations like a dominant gene, and this persists even to cases where, say, only 1 out of 8 great-grandparents was black. And it may not show in skin color at all. It's the racist contamination metaphor, as Lionel Tiger pointed out to me, the touch of the tar brush. Our language lacks the equivalent touch of whitewash and is ill-equipped to deal with a continuum of intermediates. Just as people must lie below or above the poverty line, so we classify people as black, even if they're in fact intermediate and almost entirely white. When an official form invites us to tick a race or ethnicity box, I recommend crossing it out and writing human. In a court of law, say at a murder trial, a jury is asked to decide beyond reasonable doubt whether a person is guilty or not guilty. In several jurisdictions, including 34 states of the United States, a guilty verdict may result in an execution. Numerous cases are on record where later evidence not available at the time of trial, especially DNA evidence, has retrospectively reversed an old verdict and in some cases led to a posthumous pardon. Courtroom dramas accurately portray the suspense that hangs in the air when the jury returns to deliver its verdict. All, including the lawyers on both sides and the judge, hold their breath while they wait to hear the foreman of the jury pronounce the words guilty or not guilty. But if the phrase beyond reasonable doubt means what it says, there should be no doubt of the outcome in the mind of anybody who sat through the same trial as the jury. That includes the judge who, as soon as the jury has delivered its verdict, is prepared to give the order for execution or to release the prisoner without a stain on his character. And yet, before the jury returned, there was enough reasonable doubt in that same judge's mind to keep him on tenterhooks waiting for the verdict. You cannot have it both ways. Either the verdict is beyond reasonable doubt, in which case there should be no suspense while the jury is out, or there is real, nail-biting suspense, in which case you cannot claim that the facts have been proved beyond reasonable doubt. American weather forecasters deliver probabilities, not certainties. 80% probability of rain. Juries are not allowed to do that, but it's what I felt like doing when I served on 3 juries. What is your verdict, guilty or not guilty? 75% probability of guilt, my lad. That would be anathema to our judges and lawyers for obvious and understandable reasons. There must be no shades of grey. The system insists on certainty, yes or no, guilty or not guilty. Judges may refuse even to accept a divided jury and will send members back into the jury room with instructions not to emerge again until they have somehow managed to achieve unanimity. How is that beyond reasonable doubt? A few more examples of the discontinuous mind at work. The exact moment of death. All religions are equally bad. No, they aren't. All may be equally untrue, but the moral consequences of some religions are orders of magnitude more evil than the moral consequences of other religions. There is a spectrum, shades of grey. Whataboutery. Many people in the recent US presidential election refrained from voting because neither candidate was perfect. They refused to vote for the lesser of two evils, by far the lesser of two evils, one might say, and therefore got something not just evil, but dangerously incompetent. By the way, if you're one of those who thinks that all politicians are equally bad, why not stand for election yourself and do it better? More whataboutery. I've discovered again and again that when I publicly condemn female genital mutilation, FGM, or support a campaign to have FGM banned, the campaign is promptly and inevitably derailed by a great chorus of whataboutery. What about male circumcision? The tyranny of the discontinuous mind can't see the difference. Rape is rape is rape. All rapes are equally bad. All deserve the same punishment. Some women who've dared to say that not all rapes are equally bad are branded, sometimes by factions of our own atheist community, as rape apologists. No means no. Maybe means no. Oklahoma was first performed in 1943. Every time I lose a wrestling match, I have a funny feeling that I won. Today, the young man who initiated the wrestling match would be in danger of imprisonment for rape. Think about it. All pedophilia is equally bad, no distinction between a single unpleasant fumble in the vestry, on the one hand, and years of sustained daily or weekly violent rape. It's all pedophilia, all equally bad. There are no half measures, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind. In An Appetite for Wonder, the first volume of my autobiography, I wrote as follows. One day, I must have been about 11, there was a master in the gallery of the squash court with me. He pulled me onto his knee and put his hand inside my shorts. He did no more than have a little feel, but it was extremely disagreeable. The cremasteric reflex is not painful, but is in a skin-crawling, creepy way. It's almost worse than painful, as well as embarrassing. As soon as I could wriggle off his lap, I ran to tell my friends, many of whom had had the same experience with him. I don't think he did any of us any lasting damage, but some years later he killed himself. End of quote. Because I said, I don't think he did any of us any lasting damage, I was pilloried, mostly by certain factions of our own atheist movement, as a pedophile apologist. There are people, distressingly many people, whose lives have literally been ruined by childhood sexual abuse. Maybe a priest, maybe a father or uncle or grandfather raped them, perhaps buggered them, day after day, night after night for years. They're traumatized for life. Suppose I had written that my 15 minutes of unpleasantness in the squash court had traumatized me for life, rather than that I don't think it did me any lasting damage. What would one of those seriously traumatized victims have said to me? How dare you? How dare you compare your 15 seconds fumble with what I had to endure for my entire life? This happily married couple from Texas, now in their 30s, pictured with their 4 daughters, are lifelong sweethearts. He's just 1 or 2 years older than her. Why is he pictured the other side of a fence from his family? To dramatize the fact that he was forbidden to associate freely with his wife and children during a 7-year probationary period because he was a registered child molester. Which child did he molest? He slept with his future wife when she was just short of her 17th birthday, and he was arrested for sexual molestation of a child. From then on, he was on a list of child molesters, and everything changed. He had to move out of his parents' home because of the presence there of a 12-year-old girl, his own sister. After he married, he was not allowed to live with his wife because of the presence in the home of a baby who was female, his own daughter. He's now through his probation and is allowed to live with his family, but he's still on the register of child molesters, and that record will follow him for the rest of his life. Anybody, including would-be employers, can look him up. It makes it very difficult for him to get a job. He can't leave his home state without registering with the local police. In Texas, the age of consent is 17. In New South Wales, it's 16. The Sydney Morning Herald reports on this happily married couple, now in their 60s. They were childhood sweethearts who'd grown up in the same street. They first had sex together when he was 16 and she was 15. He was arrested and branded a sex offender, which went on his record for the rest of his life. They'd been married 40 years when he suddenly found that he was not allowed to get a job repairing the roof of a school because somebody dug up his police record as a sex offender. An Australian lawyer, Deborah Marr, said the following: "It's outrageous that a person should be labeled a paedophile and be put on the register for a consensual act with a 15-year-old when they themselves were 16. Miss Marr said, "This young person may have committed an offense, but he is not a paedophile." In one case, Miss Marr said, a juvenile convicted of a minor sexual offense involving a 15-year-old girl had to move out of the family home because he was not allowed to live in a home with children, including his younger siblings. He also lost his job, which may have brought him into contact with children. Now, I understand that for legal purposes, there is no getting away from clear dividing lines, a clear-cut cut-off point, such as the stroke of midnight on the 17th or 16th birthday. Nevertheless, it's surely grotesquely unfair that such a man would be lumped in with violent pedophiles who rape tiny children. It's surely ridiculous that child is defined in such a discontinuous way that a tiny baby is placed in the same category as a young woman on the eve of her 17th birthday. And consequently, a loving husband and father cannot live with his wife and daughter. Is it really beyond the wit of humanity to come up with something a little closer to a sliding scale, even if it were only to add one more threshold below which we recognize the horrible crime of true pedophiliac molestation?
Either you're with us, either you love freedom and with nations which embrace freedom, or you're with the enemy. There's no in between. Either you're with us or you're with the enemy. That's clear. I will continue to make that clear.
The tyranny of the discontinuous mind. Militant atheists are as bad as ISIS terrorists. Don't we get that all the time? don't know where all those question marks came from. I can hardly read that. Oh, yeah, that's the same thing as Ricky Gervais. Can you read that? Yeah. Same point. Sorry about that slide. I must have gone to sleep with my finger on the key. A Covfefe moment. Scientists are called upon by governments, by courts of law, by the public at large, to give a definite, absolute yes or no answer to important questions. For example, questions of risk. Whether it's a new medicine, a new weed killer, a new power station, a new airliner, the scientific expert is peremptorily asked, is it safe? Answer the question, yes or no, is it safe? Vainly, the scientist tries to explain that safety and risk are not absolutes. Some things are safer than others, and nothing is perfectly safe. There's a sliding scale of intermediates and probabilities, not hard and fast discontinuities between safe and unsafe. I hope I've said enough to suggest that the summary demand for an absolute yes or no answer, so beloved of journalists, politicians, and finger-wagging, hectoring lawyers, is yet another unreasonable expression of a kind of tyranny, the tyranny of the discontinuous mind, the dead hand of Plato. Thank you very much.
Okay. Professor Dawkins has agreed to do some Q&A, so step right up. Question mark. Member.
Okay, I'm sure that a lot of other people have a number of scintillating and interesting questions for you. I have a very simple question for you. For those of us that, of course, hate freedom. A while back you did some people don't know this, a while back you did a collaboration with Nightwish on an album, and you expanded some of the beauty of the universe, and there was quotes from Carl Sagan and Thomas Huxley, and you did the narration for it, and I was just curious, how did that come about, and it's sort of a weird thing to mesh with pop culture in that way,
Yes.
How did you feel about that, and would you do it again, and who would? If you could choose
Well,
anybody.
I'm more cool than you think. Nightwish is a largely Finnish a pop group that comes from Finland. I think they're called heavy metal. Is that right? Okay. They approached me. The lead singer and songwriter is a fan of my books, and he approached me to ask me to do this narration. And they came to Oxford, came to a studio, and I just recorded words. There were some of my own words, some of Carl Sagan's words. I forget who else's words they were. And they used them in their music inspired by science. And they made a record. Rather more memorable for me, they did a concert at Wembley, which is a huge, great space in London. And I went there and did my reading live, my recitation live there. So that was quite thrilling, actually, and they're delightful people, wonderful, about half a dozen singers, players, drummers, guitarists, etc. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope to do it again with them sometime.
Professor Dawkins, I think statistics would show that people of higher IQ, more intelligent, better able to take care of themselves, have fewer children. So from an evolutionary perspective, should we be concerned?
Well, I have to tread carefully here. It's a politically sensitive field. There's an odd effect which is called the Flynn effect. Have you heard of the Flynn effect? It's something that, yes. A psychologist called Flynn has measured IQ throughout the 20th century, and he obviously had to do this in a sophisticated way, but what he found was that there has been a steady and rather dramatic increase in IQ during the 20th century. As an educator at Oxford University, taking in students year after year, I must say I didn't notice it, but nevertheless, it is well established. Obviously, as you know, IQ is standardized so that the mean is always 100. So obviously he had to take account of that. And I can't quite remember how he did that, but he's a good psychologist and statistician, and he would have done that right. And it does look as though the Flynn effect is real. I think I'm right in saying it's largely unexplained. I did meet Flynn once, and I asked him for an explanation, and he didn't really produce a very unitary one. It was rather more the kind of explanation you give when you ask a computer scientist to explain Moore's law, which, as you know, is a logarithmic increase in an exponential increase in computer power, which is astonishingly lawful, straight line on a log scale. And it doesn't seem to have any single cause. It seems to be a kind of summed effect of various causes. And I think Flynn thinks that that's what the Flynn effect is. So the pessimistic expectation from your eugenics question doesn't seem to be realized. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that.
I had the privilege of listening to Penny Left talk one time, and one of the things he was asked was actually about you, and what was the most interesting or unique thing about Richard Dawkins. And he said, basically about your kindness and your sensitivity, that things actually hit you harder than you actually would ever, articulate to anybody else. You take it on the chin, as it were. And when I saw the whole thing about when you talk about the mild case of pedophilia, and I can identify with that because I had a similar thing happen when I was a child, was a babysitter. It was no really big deal. So I kind of dismiss it as well. And I would never classify it into the same category as, like you said, children who are molested on a regular basis in a very violent way. But to the effect that people's criticism of you, how do you deal with that? Because I do believe that you're a sensitive man who actually takes in a lot of these criticisms and it takes it personally. Do you actually do that, and how do you deal with that? Because being a celebrity of sorts, you get more than anybody else would.
One way to deal with it is to go on YouTube and read out your hate mail. It is a rich vein of humor to mine. And it's things like, I hope you get a painful cancer and die a horrible death. I hope you get run over by a church van. But the champion one, as I was telling my table at dinner, was one that I haven't actually read on YouTube yet, is rather charming, actually. It's, I hope you lose your watch and are late for an important appointment. most of that hate mail came from creationists. That doesn't hurt me a bit. I mean, it seems to me an honor to be disliked by creationists. I do confess it does hurt me when I get it from what I think of as my own people, and that hurts.
Hi, I'm Christine with the pro-life humanist booth that's right across the hall, and I won't take up Q&A time to answer it here, but I just want to say I would be more than happy to answer the question that you raised on the question of twinning. It's actually a whole lot easier to answer when you don't believe in souls. My question is, though, I just want to understand if I got this correct. You argued that we are a continuous whole from baby up to adulthood, so that there is no actual point when you continue to grow and develop over the course of your lifetime. So I'm wondering then why you draw a distinction when it comes to our embryonic life, fetal life, that progressed up to our infant life. Why there then should be that distinction, or why you believe there should be a distinction.
Yes, you mean if we're saying that from zygote through to senility, it's all one continuous one continuous process. Why make a distinction at the moment of birth? Is what you're saying? Yes. Well, Francis Crick actually didn't. He put his head on the chopping block and said that you should be allowed to kill children until they're up to the age of 1. So he followed it through its logical conclusion. I think that there sometimes are cases where the slippery slope argument argues for a definite discontinuity. There's one case where I think a discontinuity can be definitely advocated strongly. Birth really is a very definite watershed moment. And if you go to the Francis Crick route and allow infanticide up to the age of 1, then I think you do you run the risk of going down a slippery slope. Where does it all end? So that's one case where I think I would defend a definite discontinuity. No killing after birth.
A prime example of the tyranny of the discontinuous mind is the categorical classification of mental disorders as defined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, D75. Mental disorders are far more sensibly defined as one end of the bell curve. In fact, usually 2 ends of the bell curve. And this is true probably not only for obvious traits like anxiety, may well be true for delusions as well in relation to irrational thinking. And of course, the reason for the bell curve, as you know so well, is genetic diversity favored by natural selection. This is the consequence of that.
Yes, thank you. And obviously, you know much more about it than I do. I suppose we do rather acknowledge that when we use the phrase "on the spectrum." It's very common to say not that so-and-so is autistic or Asperger's, but he's on the spectrum. So that's one place where popular language does recognize that there is a spectrum there, and we're all on it.
Professor Dawkins, thank you, first and foremost. I hope you'll forgive me a bit of an esoteric question. I was wondering, what is your opinion on the Red Queen hypothesis, and how, if at all, do you think it might apply to ideas of cultural evolution and proliferation of beings?
The Red Queen hypothesis gets its name from Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass. Alice, you may remember, was holding the hand of the Red Queen, and the Red Queen was running and running and running and dragging Alice along, and they weren't getting anywhere. And Alice was a bit surprised by this and said, well, we don't seem to be getting anywhere. Where I come from, if you run this fast, you'd get somewhere. And the Queen said, a slow sort of country. Why, here you have to run as fast as you can in order to stay in the same place. And that has been used as a metaphor in evolutionary theory for, in the broad sense, arms races. An arms race, an evolutionary arms race, is something like an arms race between predator and prey, or parasite and host, where, unlike adapting to climate, say ice ages or droughts or something like that, when you are a prey animal adapting to a predator, or when you are a predator adapting to a prey animal, the other side of what you're adapting to is evolving at the same time. And so as you get better at running away from leopards, say, leopards get better at catching, at running after you. And so there's an ever-continuing escalation. And this is the Red Queen effect. This is running as fast as you can in evolutionary time in order to stay in the same place. It's been used especially in the arms race between parasites and hosts, where parasites, bacteria, for example, evolve very fast because they have very short generation times. And my late colleague W.D. Hamilton used this to very good effect in trying to explain the evolution of sex and sexual selection in the arms race against parasites. Because parasites are evolving so fast, it's necessary, animals have to evolve extremely fast in order to keep up with this. And for example, it's going to take a rather long time to answer this. It's a rather technical subject. Hamilton invoked the Red Queen effect in order to explain the evolution of sex. Was one of many theories to explain the evolution of sex, which is a bit of a mystery in evolutionary theory. And I think I won't go into that too much because it's rather specialized. But yeah.
Good evening. I'm going to begin my question by quoting a comment to a post by the New York Times related to Trump's withdrawal from the recent Paris Agreement. It says, everybody is criticizing Trump for dropping out of the Paris Agreement. First of all, it's saving American taxpayers, and second, it's saving American jobs. And I tell you right now, all caps, every Christian should stand with Donald Trump because everyone is complaining and crying that the world won't last much longer. Well, let me tell you this. I believe, as well as President Donald Trump, in the one true God, and his, in caps, will and plans be done no matter what the decisions of mankind may be. The world will only end when God says it will end, and that's a fact. My question is two parts. How would you answer or respond to this person? And can you deal with irrational people with facts?
I read that. It's a shocking story. It shows what we are up against. What we are up against is something truly shocking, that people like that, people of that level, that low-grade mentality can get elected in large numbers. There are lots of them like that. That was a particularly spectacular example of religious stupidity. Not just stupidity, but spilling over into public policy, into actually making decisions which affect everybody, because your idiotic religion tells you that God will intervene before the earth is destroyed by, as it happens, climate change. It could be anything else. We saw it before, we've seen it in other times. It means we've got a lot of work to do, and when people, I expect there are many people here from the United States, elect better Congress. Stand for Congress yourself, change the climate, raise consciousness such that it's no longer believed, it's no longer accepted that you have to be religious in order to get elected. That's one of the problems, is that in the United States it is widely, almost universally believed that you can't get elected unless you are religious. That may be true, but the number of non-religious in the United States is now more than 20%, according to polls, which puts non-believers on a par with any other particular religious group. The non-religious in the United States are really very numerous. They could be a very powerful lobby if they only got together and behaved as a lobby. Far more numerous than the Jewish lobby, far more numerous than the Muslim lobby. than the Polish lobby, the Irish lobby, all the other lobbies that politicians suck up to. It shouldn't be possible for people like that to get elected. Obviously, it's a democratic process, but people shouldn't be voting for them. There's a lovely law on the English statutes, still on the statute book, which says, no idiot shall be elected to Parliament.
For your speech tonight. I'll preface this with, I'm a clinical epidemiologist, and I spend my days trying to classify people into one of two categories so I can develop a 2x2 table. And
Sorry, I didn't hear what you are?
a clinical epidemiologist.
Clinical epidemiologist.
Epidemiologist, right, yes.
So one of the things that struck me when you were speaking tonight was my field relies exclusively on the ability to dichotomize and look at populations and try to fit them into one of two categories. But then the thing that I was thinking of was when I actually see a patient in front of me, I don't know where on the spectrum or on what part of the population those patients fit. So is the problem with the discontinuous mind that people can't make the leap from a population level generalization of what's occurring down to the individual level that they're looking at in front of them?
Not quite sure I understand the question. Can you're not talking about diagnosing particular patients, are you?
Well, I think that when you're talking about the discontinuous mind and you're looking to say you're this or you're that, you're black or you're white, I think that on a population level we can see distinctions that occur.
But between subgroups in the population?
Yes, probably not that example in particular, but with diseases, we rely on being able to dichotomize patients into one or the other type of
But
disease.
what are the categories you're dividing them into?
Diseased or not diseased would be
Oh.
that sort of thing. But
Oh,
then
I can
you
see
look-
that would be discontinuous, yes. Yeah.
But is the problem with applying a discontinuous mind philosophy that you're preaching, and I totally agree with it, is the problem that people can't translate those population level, those bell curve type ideas down to the individual when they're actually...
No, I think it's that when you really do have a definite decision to say, is this person sick or not? Has this person got flu or not? That is a discontinuous decision which you have to make as a doctor. What I was talking about is cases where there is no need to draw a line, and where you express the result like the obesity threshold or the poverty threshold. It's as though you can't just say, here's the distribution of incomes in the population, or here's the number of people who have an income lower than so and so many dollars a week. You have to say, below the poverty line, that's all I was saying. I mean, there are times when the discontinuity really is there, and of course it's important to recognize it. Okay.
Hello, Professor Dawkins. Thank you for being here. You're helping us. I have to say that. I have a personal question for you. As someone at the beginning of my journey, compared to yourself as an intellectual, with everything that we see in our world, with everything that's around us, the good and the bad, what brings you peace and comfort? Peace. What brings you peace?
Well, nature, mountains, rivers. I've just seen Niagara Falls. I've been to Grand Canyon quite recently. I've been to Antarctica. So I love that. Music, definitely. Chamber music. Poetry. I was saying this today, how much I appreciate poetry and how I've always been a bit puzzled about what poetry actually is and why I love it so much. And I think I got a glimpse of that in the analysis of Auden's poems today. I really got that. Human love, affection, plenty of things like that. Yeah.
Okay, you can have the last word because you haven't had one all night. I know. No, I want him to have it.
There's one here.
Oh,
No,
is she?
I know.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, let's have that one as well then. Okay.
We'll have them both, but I just want to have him first.
Okay, go ahead.
He's been at the mic 10 times.
Okay,
and
right.
He's never got up.
Okay, right. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
All right, sorry. So Professor Dawkins, so do you think the Western culture is becoming more accepting of terrorism in the way that to no longer seem racist? For example, the London mayor's recent comments on the Manchester attack, where he said it's part and parcel to living in a city. You're expected to have this. I guess.
More accepting. I'm not sure about that. By the way, there's been another attack in London tonight, which I think the details are still coming in. I'm not quite sure what you're asking. I think there possibly might be something to be said for playing down the news of such things a bit. I think that perhaps one of the things the terrorists love is the publicity that follows on from such things. And so in a way we're playing into their hands by reacting in such a strong way to... but I don't think that's what you're asking, is it? I'm not quite sure that
Sorry, let me explain this a little bit better. It's more excusing the actions of them so we don't seem racist, we don't investigate.
Oh, yes. Yes, well, there is certainly a tendency to be reluctant to condemn the true root cause of this terrorism, which is Islamism, because people are afraid of being thought racist, Islamophobic, as we heard from Ali today. So yes, I mean, and I deplore that. I think if ever we needed to call a spade, it's now the culprit is religion, it's Islam, it's Islamism, which of course is nothing to do with condemning every individual Muslim, and that's very important to say. But the constant litany that politicians trot out, this is nothing to do with Islam. Of course it's to do with Islam.
So my final question is that I think what you talked about the tyranny of I forget, but I think it has a lot to do with, at least it reminds me of linguistics, because the way we speak colloquially, it's very arbitrary. That's why in philosophical arguments we kind of have to define a specific term. And in language, there's different variabilities, like German language is a bit more literal. So my question is, do you think that we can sort of reshape language to be that, so that it's more literal, and does it define that tyranny, or do you think that would not be as practical as a result?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Did you?
I'm not quite sure.
Okay, let me rephrase this.
So you're talking about language. What effect do you think language has? What are you asking about language?
Yeah, so for example, in language we use the word poverty itself, right?
Right.
We could be more specific and say someone making less than $20,000 per particular year. So I was just wondering if you think that in language we need to be more specific about that to avoid that tyranny of different minds.
Well, we can use language to say exactly how poor somebody is. That's my only point. You don't have to draw a line. You can do that in any language.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I guess it just,
Okay.
my question is just that whether that would be practical on a colloquial basis.
So I'm finding it hard to understand. I'm sorry.
It's all right.
Okay. Does anybody want to say what? Sorry?
Is there a linguistic solution?
Yeah.
Discontinuous mind. There you go. Language or linguistics. Discontinuity just by language itself is inherent. Words
Well, does language itself impose discontinuities? No. Well, if it does, use numbers then.
Sign some books?
Yeah, I'll sign books, yeah.
Okay, so Professor Dawkins is going to sign some books. And I think probably the best way to do that is at our registration table. There's lots of room there, and it's outside in the hall. So we'll get him there. So let him get there. And line up to get your book signed. If you have a full weekend pass ticket, maybe you can pass on that, and he'll sign some tomorrow. So let's just try and get the folks that are just here tonight to get theirs signed. All right? Okay, everybody. Thanks. Awesome.